You're tuned into That's Life, where we celebrate the beauty, the chaos, and the wonder of real life. Sometimes it makes you laugh, sometimes it makes you cry, but it always makes you feel. Settle in. We're just getting started. Little Billy sat on the bench, gazing into the stream of people. There were many of them. Some strolled leisurely along the park alleys, others hurried about their business. The crowd was a riot of bright colors, noisy and diverse. In the park, there were very young creatures, adults, and those who were the same height as Billy. The latter were carefully held by the hand by their elders, mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers. Billy had also come to this park with his mother. Before that, they had ridden on a train for a very long time. For the boy, it was his first such journey. Never before had he seen such gigantic, steaming steel behemoths, emitting a strange, yet in its own way, pleasant smell. On the platform, unaccustomed to such a sight, he was even a little scared. "What's wrong? Are you a girl?" Uncle Mitch chuckled, noticing how Billy flinched away from the carriage. "Your mother said she gave birth to a boy." Billy couldn't stand Uncle Mitch. This loud, perpetually unshaven, gloomy man aroused a strong dislike in him. But his mother, it seemed, harbored tender feelings for him. She hugged him, kissed him, stroked his hair, and tried in every way to please him. Billy could not understand what could be attractive about this man. When Uncle Mitch first appeared in their tiny apartment, he initially even liked the boy, as he brought a cake, sweets, juice, and a bouquet of flowers for his mother. It felt like a holiday, and Billy loved holidays. The man stayed to live with them in their small apartment with creaky floorboards and wide windowsills. Billy loved his home with all his heart. So old, so familiar, wooden, two-storied, with neighbors who were always kind to the boy. He didn't understand why the adults called this place an old barracks and lamented that it should have been torn down long ago. Why? Where? It's so great here. This is the best place in the world, Billy once declared to his neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, who often chatted with the curious little boy and treated him to something tasty. She burst out laughing so hard, tears came to her eyes, and then for some reason grew sad and hugged Billy tightly. Mrs. Gable was good, very kind. The boy missed her on this trip, although he enjoyed his first adventure in life. Uncle Mitch didn't like Mrs. Gable either. She called him a tyrant, a drunkard, and a good-for-nothing. Billy didn't quite understand the meaning of these words, but by the way his neighbor pronounced them, he felt they were something very bad. And the boy completely agreed with Mrs. Gable. When Uncle Mitch moved into their apartment, his mother's former friends stopped visiting. And there was some good in this, because they would sit in the kitchen all night, laughing loudly, making noise, often swearing, and even starting quarrels. At such moments, Billy would hide under the bed, afraid he might get hurt. It was terrifying and unpleasant. But Uncle Mitch chased them all away. Silence reigned in the house. But unfortunately, not for long, the man turned out to be much worse than his mother's friends. He yelled at his mother and Billy, was constantly dissatisfied with something, and demanded unquestioning obedience. And then people started coming to the apartment again. Only this time, they were Uncle Mitch's friends, just as gloomy, just as angry as he was. Billy was terrified of them, very terrified. He felt that these people were capable of harming him or his mother. Sometimes Uncle Mitch would kick Billy out the door, saying, "Go for a walk, you're annoying," and lock it. The boy tried to explain that it was freezing or raining outside, that he would sit quietly like a mouse in his room and wouldn't bother anyone. But Uncle Mitch was adamant, and his mother echoed everything he said. So the boy would wander for hours in the deserted yard. It was good if Mrs. Gable met him and took him to her place. The old lady's apartment was always clean and smelled of something delicious. And although Billy loved his own home, looking at Mrs. Gable's bright rooms, the little boy understood that their own apartment was always in disarray. There were no empty bottles lying around in the corners at the neighbors, and the floor was free of dust, dirt, and rubbish. Bookcases lined the walls. Billy loved looking at the pictures in them. Mrs. Gable had even started teaching him to read. Progress was quick. The boy was already joining letters into words. It seemed like real magic. Incomprehensible scribbles suddenly acquired a perfectly concrete meaning. But the learning process had to be interrupted. "We're leaving here tomorrow," his mother announced one day. "I've already packed the things." "Well, there's nothing to pack anyway," Uncle Mitch rasped from the next room. "And where are we going?" Billy asked. "To a better life," his mother replied evasively. "Somewhere where everything will be completely different." That night, Billy couldn't sleep. Excitement kept him awake. So many thoughts crowded his little head, and anticipation of a miracle had settled in his heart. Something special was about to happen. Something completely new. The unknown was a little scary, but the changes were still joyful. In the morning, Billy was barely able to wake up. "Get up quickly, or we'll leave, and you'll stay here," Uncle Mitch roared, looking at his mother's futile attempts to rouse her sleepy son from the sofa. Billy immediately jumped up. He understood. Uncle Mitch wasn't joking or threatening. He was truly capable of such a thing. He would do it. The station greeted the boy with a colorful, alluring bustle. Billy held his mother's hand tightly. Her hands were busy with bags. The little boy was very afraid of getting lost in this boundless sea of people. And then they went out onto the platform, and the astonished boy's eyes beheld the train, a behemoth, radiating heat, gleaming and puffing menacingly like a red-hot iron. "Mrs. Gable?" The boy was seeing a real locomotive for the first time. No, of course, there were pictures of trains in Mrs. Gable's books. But an illustration was one thing, and seeing such a machine live was another. The train was both frightening and admirable. "What are you gaping at like an idiot?" Uncle Mitch roughly nudged the frozen Billy. "Let's go," his mother agreed, and moved toward the train. Inside, it was even better than Billy could have imagined. Uncle Mitch and his mother settled on the lower bunks, and he was put on the upper one. From there, it was very convenient and interesting to observe the life of the carriage. And what views opened from the window. Billy even fell silent for several hours, which didn't happen often with him. Forests, fields, villages flashed by. it turned out the world was so vast, so beautiful. How he wished he could wander through those groves, throw pebbles into the rivers and lakes flashing outside the window. And sometimes on neighboring tracks, oncoming trains pass by, passenger and freight. The most curious were those carrying machinery. Billy liked the clatter of the wheels. It was calming, promising adventures and joyful encounters. When dusk thickened outside the window and his mother told her son to go to bed, Billy lay and listened to this measured sound. It lulled the boy, tired from new impressions, to sleep. In the morning, Billy was woken by the train's long whistle. At first, the boy didn't even understand where he was and was a little scared. Then he remembered everything, smiled, hung his head down, made sure his mother and Uncle Mitch were sleeping on the lower bunks, calmed down, and stared out the window again. The train was speeding through an extraordinarily picturesque hilly area. The landscapes were mesmerizing, making his tiny heart clench with delight. Billy suddenly felt a passionate desire to take an album and pencils and try to capture this beauty. Only he didn't have an album or pencils. All that was left at Mrs. Gable's. It was she who gave him such things, while his mother and Uncle Mitch believed that spoiling children was unnecessary and that a child of 4 years old couldn't draw anyway. After some time, the adults woke up. All three had a leisurely snack of bread and sausage and drank tea from glasses in silver holders. It was very tasty. And then the boy was told to get back on the upper bunk and sit there quietly. Uncle Mitch warned. Otherwise, they'll notice and kick you off. You don't have a ticket. You're riding for free. Billy was scared by these words and obediently took his place. He liked being on the upper bunk, but the boy's legs were already numb. He really wanted to walk through the carriage, see who else was traveling, meet someone, maybe even run a little in the narrow corridor. Only Uncle Mitch had made it clear he mustn't. And if he didn't obey him, Billy didn't even want to imagine what that would mean for him. After some time, the train stopped. Billy looked out the window. They were at a crowded station. They had probably arrived in some big city. "Let's take a walk," his mother suddenly suggested. "Let's stretch our legs a bit. It's a long stop. We'll have time. We'll get some fresh air." "Just the perfect place," Uncle Mitch approved. Billy was very happy. At last, he would go outside. He wondered what kind of city it was. What were the people like there? What were the streets like? Now everything would become clear. It was good that Uncle Mitch wasn't going with them. Billy liked walking with his mother. Just the two of them. But lately, that hadn't happened often. And now, unexpected joy. At the station, his mother bought Billy a delicious pie with jam. The boy walked, holding her hand tightly, and looked around with curiosity. What a wonderful place. Passers-by smiled at the wide-eyed little boy. The sun shone brightly from the sky. Sparrows chirped. "Oh, to stay here forever," Billy said dreamily. His mother smiled strangely. Then they came to a park. There were so many wondrous swings, so many magnificent slides. In his own town, Billy had never seen such splendor. "Can I?" he asked his mother, looking at the bright playground. "Of course," his mother nodded. She sat on a bench opposite and waved her hand as if to say, go and have fun. I'll wait for you here." Billy rushed to the playground with all his might. He rode on carousels and swings, navigated rope labyrinths, and jumped on a trampoline. His delight was boundless. What happiness that he and his mother had gone for a walk in this wonderful city. There were many children around. They laughed and played, chasing each other. Billy joined first one group, then another. No one chased him away. On the contrary, they were happy when the boy arrived. Well, that was right. The more people, the merrier. Finally, Billy felt very tired and missed his mother. Besides, he was also hungry. He wondered how long he had spent on this wonderful playground and why he hadn't been called yet. It was time to go back. The boy ran to the bench where his mother had been sitting. But the bench was empty. Two old ladies, watching their grandchildren, were comfortably seated on the neighboring bench. On the next one, a man with a stroller. There were no more benches near the playground, and his mother wasn't there either. How could this be? Where was his mother? What had happened to her? Maybe she had just gone to buy water or a pie and would be back soon, and she would even laugh at Billy for being such a scaredy cat, as long as she didn't tell Uncle Mitch, or he would tease him about being a girl again. The boy settled down next to the old ladies, who paid him no attention, so engrossed were they in conversation. His mother had been sitting on this very bench, the one next to them, so she would come back here. How else? Time passed. The old ladies called their grandchildren and left. The other benches also emptied. There were almost no children left on the playground. Dusk was falling. But Billy just sat there as if glued, waiting for his mother. He was cold and hungry. He was very scared. Adults hurried past on their business. Billy tried to spot a familiar, beloved face in the crowd, but deep down, the little one began to understand. His mother wasn't coming. Something terrible had happened, something incredible. Maybe his mother had disappeared, or had that evil Uncle Mitch come and taken her, ordering Billy to stay here. His mother always obeyed him after all. What should he do? It was so scary, so cold, so lonely, and the people no longer seemed as friendly as they had in the morning, and the sun no longer shone so brightly and welcomingly. Even the playground didn't bring joy. Look, all the swings were free now. Sit on whichever you want, no need to even queue. But he didn't want to at all. And suddenly, the boy caught something familiar in the crowd. No, it wasn't his mother. An elderly woman, very much like Mrs. Gable, was walking slowly along the path. Not so much in appearance, but in her expression, her gait, her mannerisms. Tears inexplicably welled up in Billy's eyes at this very moment. This woman couldn't be evil. Like Mrs. Gable, she would help him in a difficult moment, tell him what to do next, support him, calm him down. The boy jumped off the bench and ran up to the stranger with the kind face. He couldn't delay. What if she walked past now and got lost in the crowd? "Hello, Auntie," Billy greeted her first thing. Mrs. Gable always said that politeness conquers cities, and told her little neighbor about the importance of good manners. "Well, hello, little one." The woman looked surprised, but very kindly. Her eyes were as blue and radiant as Mrs. Gable's. This discovery gave Billy confidence. "Do you happen to know where my mother is? I'm very cold now, and I'm hungry too, but she's still not here." A flicker of anxiety crossed the woman's face. She knelt down in front of the boy so their eyes were level. "Little one, are you lost?" "I don't know, honestly," Billy replied. "But I think it's not me who's lost, but my mother. I stayed where she left me, but she's nowhere." Eleanor Vance had been delayed at the clinic. Her blood pressure had been fluctuating lately, so she had to visit periodically. "Age, what did you expect?" the local doctor would say, spreading her hands, and prescribe more medication and tests. Age? Yes, she wasn't a girl anymore. A whole year on well-deserved retirement, it was hard to believe. Eleanor Vance had worked as a seamstress all her life. She had worked shifts at a large factory, toiled at private enterprises, and taken orders at home. The very difficult times when there was barely enough for bread were in the past. Eleanor Vance still remembered the despair of those days. It was then that the incident occurred for which the woman blamed herself her entire life. Sometimes it seemed that her conscience had quieted down, that she had managed to convince herself that there was no other way to act. But then, the guilt would return and weigh down with renewed force. Outwardly, Eleanor Vance remained calm and even cheerful. No one suspected the heavy thoughts churning in her head. She and her husband rarely spoke about what had happened. Eleanor Vance suspected that he too suffered deeply inside. At least, a hidden sadness was often visible in her husband's eyes. Of course, something like that is impossible to forget. Those were the difficult 90s. Eleanor Vance disappeared into work, toiling in 2 shifts. She would crawl home in the evenings, tired and exhausted. The young woman's legs, back, and arms literally ached from fatigue and overstrain. Her eyes watered. They paid pennies for this labor, and even those were regularly delayed, citing the difficult economic situation. "No one is keeping you here," the director would tell all the dissatisfied. "If you don't want to work, write your resignation. There's a queue for your place, be sure of that." And it was true. Enterprises were collapsing one after another. People were left without means of subsistence. Eleanor Vance understood that she wouldn't find work in the city and therefore endured. She worked overtime, went in on weekends. She came home squeezed like a lemon. And in the small apartment they rented from a very principled old lady, their 2-year-old Sarah was waiting for them. By the time Eleanor Vance returned, her husband usually managed to pick up the little girl from kindergarten. The man had recently lost his job. A promising engineer now did odd jobs in the evenings. Sometimes he drove a taxi. Sometimes he unloaded trucks. Sometimes he helped at construction sites. He hadn't been laid off, but finding a new place was very difficult. Her husband had even given up on his qualifications, looking for an electrician's position. His education allowed him to work in this field, but times were such that work was hard to find. So he scraped by with casual earnings. The young couple's parents couldn't help the family. They themselves were barely surviving and were already elderly. Both Eleanor Vance and her husband were late children in their families. The situation was more than desperate. But Eleanor Vance remembered those times even with a certain nostalgia. She and her husband were young and loved each other very much. Then it seemed that everything would settle down, that financial difficulties wouldn't last forever. Their beloved daughter was nearby, bringing joy with new achievements every day, and most importantly, they hadn't yet committed the act for which they now felt guilty. their conscience was absolutely clear, which is why life felt easier and calmer then, despite the financial troubles. Eleanor Vance remembered well the day she found out she was pregnant again. She hadn't been feeling well lately. At first, she dismissed the worrying symptoms, attributing them to lack of sleep, nerves, and poor nutrition. But then, after work, she finally went to see a doctor. "You're pregnant," the doctor pronounced after the examination. "And already 12, 13 weeks? It's strange you didn't notice earlier. It's not your first time." Eleanor Vance sat as if struck by lightning. She understood, of course, that something was wrong with her body, but she attributed it to the effects of stress and hard work. Without hesitation, the woman wanted to immediately schedule an abortion. She remembered perfectly how happy she had been about the news of her first pregnancy. Now, however, Eleanor Vance felt only fear. She clearly understood that their family, on the verge of survival, could not afford another baby. Somewhere deep down, the woman desperately wanted to be a mother again, to feel that wonderful feeling once more. But now it was impossible. "An abortion?" the doctor asked tiredly, irritation on his face. "Did you hear the term I mentioned? It's too late. You'll have to give birth." Eleanor Vance barely made it home. Tiny hammers pounded in her temples, burning tears welled up in her eyes. All sorts of feelings battled in her soul, from joy, strangely enough, to despair, and also thoughts. They danced a frantic jig in Eleanor Vance's head. Her subconscious furiously searched for a way out of the situation. Find a healer who could help get rid of the fetus? That was terrifying. That was dangerous. Try working from home to provide for the growing family? Unreliable, problematic with a big belly, and then with 2 babies in the house. Eleanor Vance was so absorbed in her thoughts that she started to cross the road on a red light. The indignant honk of a car brought her back to her senses. She had to pull herself together, share the news with her husband. He was a man. Let him decide. Eleanor Vance remembered well the look of fear and despair that appeared on her husband's face when he learned about the pregnancy. Perhaps she herself had looked the same at the doctor's office. "Well," her husband said uncertainly, "since it happened, we'll have the baby. What else can we do? I think I found a job in a workshop." "But what kind of workshop?" "Just a guy in a garage, reupholstering furniture. Plus I'll work nights. We'll get by somehow." "Since it happened." Her husband hugged Eleanor Vance, trying to cheer her up. Then he got ready and slipped out of the house. A freight train was arriving at the station today, and they needed loaders. The woman felt a sharp pity for her husband, an excellent specialist, an outstanding mind. He was invaluable at his research institute, so many awards, so much respect. And now, a loader and an apprentice. It was frustrating. And this child, because of him, they will both have to work even harder. But then, little Sarah whimpered on the floor. Usually she could play with her toys for a long time, and suddenly, tears. The woman touched her forehead. It was hot. And Eleanor Vance took care of her daughter. All other thoughts and problems receded for a while. This second unwanted pregnancy was very difficult. Eleanor Vance often felt unwell. Nauseous, dizzy, dark spots danced before her eyes. All this, of course, affected her work. Firing a pregnant woman wasn't easy, but the director forced her to write a resignation letter of her own free will. I don't need workers like you, constant sick leave, not meeting quotas. If you don't write it yourself, I'll fire you for professional incompetence. And then you won't find work anywhere with such a black mark. There was even less money. Her husband, of course, tried very hard. He worked in the furniture reupholstery workshop, took on any odd job, but there was a catastrophic lack of money for living. And now a baby would appear soon. Eleanor Vance felt nothing for the infant stirring under her heart. She had awaited her daughter with love and joy, talked to her, sang her songs, but she considered the younger child a burden who had decided to ruin their lives. She scolded herself for such thoughts, but couldn't help it. And only just before the birth, when it was time to prepare the baby's layette, Eleanor Vance softened a little, because she was sure she was expecting a son this time. And so she sewed him several wonderful blue suits and rompers and stitched diapers with little airplanes. Looking at all these tiny things, the woman, for the first time, felt some warm feelings towards the belly dweller. That's what her husband playfully called the baby. He, for his part, was eagerly awaiting his arrival, making plans, even managing to be happy, although he was very tired from his jobs. The baby was born on a nasty November night. In between painful contractions, Eleanor Vance heard gusts of wind beating against the windows and cold rain drumming. Finally, a wrinkled, crying red creature was placed on the exhausted woman's chest. "A boy," the midwife said indifferently, and hurried to another woman in labor. Eleanor Vance looked at her son and couldn't understand her feelings. She had expected that upon seeing the little one, she would be filled with tenderness for him. That's how it was the first time. But now, the woman thought only about how to feed and raise this extra mouth. The baby was taken away, and she was sent to the ward. Eleanor Vance sank into sleep with pleasure. She was very tired, both physically and emotionally. And in the morning, sad news awaited her. After the babies were brought for feeding and taken away, the doctor came into the ward. She said a few words to each mother about their babies, but asked Eleanor Vance to come to her office in half an hour. The woman froze. She understood that something was wrong with her child. Why else such special attention? At the appointed time, Eleanor Vance entered the chief doctor's office on stiff legs. "Please sit down." The woman in the white coat smiled tiredly, gesturing to the armchair in front of the desk. "It turns out the newborn boy has serious heart and kidney problems. He needs treatment, lifelong treatment. There are medications, but they are expensive." "We have no money at all," Eleanor Vance stammered, turning cold. Yes, she hadn't been filled with love at first sight for the newborn, but he was her son, and the news of his illnesses was a cruel blow. And then, expensive medications. Where would they get the money for them if they were barely making ends meet? The doctor began to talk about foundations that help families in such difficult situations. It turned out there were also sponsors in the city who supported sick children. But you had to ask, gather documents, knock on every door. A way out will be found. The main thing is the desire, the tired woman in the white coat assured the shocked mother. It was easy for her to say she hadn't given birth to a sick child. And then there was the discharge, and the difficult life began with a sick newborn and a capricious 3-year-old. And all this in conditions of family financial catastrophe. They decided to name their son Thomas. The name was chosen by her husband. It was the name of his great-grandfather. The ancestor was distinguished by excellent health, lived almost to 100 years old, and was in his right mind and on his own feet all that time. The man believed that the name would help the new Thomas to become healthy and strong. Eleanor Vance didn't object. Thomas it was, it made no difference. She herself had no desire to think about a name for the boy. The child turned out to be very restless. He cried a lot, slept little, and ate poorly. Sarah, who was jealous of her mother for the new family member, was completely out of control, constantly capricious and demanding attention. Eleanor Vance was going crazy from all this. But the most important thing was Thomas's health problems. They were confirmed at the children's clinic. It turned out that the situation was even worse than initially expected. The child required lifelong therapy with expensive drugs. Charitable foundations partially paid for the medications. But still, a large part of the family's budget now went to treatment. Eleanor Vance perfectly understood that Thomas was not to blame for anything, but she still almost hated this tiny tormentor for all the difficulties he caused their family. Eleanor Vance didn't recognize herself. She had always believed that the defining traits of her personality were kindness, mercy, and compassion. How could a woman who used to not pass by a hungry kitten calmly think such things about her sick, tiny son? But you can't command your feelings. Only later did Eleanor Vance understand and analyze her state at that time. A difficult pregnancy, the preceding work in multiple shifts, lack of money, serious diagnoses for the child, lack of help, lack of prospects, all together led to a severe state. And this is very serious and requires treatment from a specialist. But who thought about professional psychological support in those difficult times? The goal was just to survive. Anyway, after a year, it became clear the family was no longer able to support a disabled child, neither morally, nor financially, nor physically. Eleanor Vance was the first to suggest a way out. "We can't cope with Thomas," she said to her husband one evening, looking him seriously in the eye. "It's obvious that he's getting worse. We can't even buy him medicine. We're constantly economizing on everything, denying ourselves everything, depriving Sarah. And still, we can't cope. I'm trying." Her husband lowered his eyes. He didn't even argue. It was obvious that his wife was telling the truth. "You're trying, I see. You'll break soon, you're not made of iron, and then we'll be completely lost. This can't go on like this. We need to do something about this urgently. I think we should put him in a special institution. At least there they will provide him with medicine. I found out that the treatment of orphans is paid for by the state budget." "In an orphanage? Are you suggesting we abandon our son?" Her husband looked at his wife with eyes wide with horror. Unlike her, he clearly had warm feelings for Thomas. He talked to him, played with him, constantly smiled at the boy, carried him on his back when he had a free minute. Of course, this happened rarely. Work took up most of his time. "Well, what's the alternative?" Eleanor Vance burst out. "Watch him slowly fade away before our eyes, spend all our money on a hopeless treatment, depriving Sarah. Should we all starve, and for his sake?" Her husband didn't answer then, but Eleanor Vance saw he was seriously considering her words. Rationally, the man understood that a severely ill child was truly beyond their means right now. But deciding on such a desperate step was difficult, very difficult. In this, Eleanor Vance understood him. Thomas had already turned 1 year old. He remarkably resembled his mother in appearance. Large blue eyes, light curls, a slightly upturned nose, an incredibly sweet child. Simply an angel from a postcard. Only very thin. Perhaps his appearance would work in Thomas's favor, and he would find wealthy parents for whom the amount needed for his treatment was pennies. And he would have a happy, prosperous, long life. But they themselves couldn't afford Thomas, that was obvious. Rented housing, lack of stable work. Thomas was not the child who could be sent to kindergarten at 2 years old and whose mother could return from maternity leave. He needed constant attention and supervision. No employer would agree to continuous sick leave. And it was terrifying to think what would happen to the child without the necessary therapy. They couldn't provide him with adequate treatment. So Eleanor Vance saw only one way out. At first, her husband tried to take control of the situation. He found another part-time job, didn't come home for days, hoping to provide the family with everything they needed. But in the end, he also understood that it was time for decisive action. Eleanor Vance remembered perfectly the morning they arrived at the orphanage with her husband. The special institution was in the neighboring region. The couple had arranged with the director in advance, so the family was expected in the office. They were met by a middle-aged woman with very anxious eyes. Looking at her husband, who was tenderly holding Thomas close, she clarified, "Are you sure you've decided? There won't be hysterics, tears, accusations against us later?" "Yes, we've thought it all through. We have no other option," Eleanor Vance replied confidently. She wanted to get the difficult procedure over with quickly. The little boy smiled, happy that he was going somewhere with his mom and dad, looking at Eleanor Vance trustingly. It was unbearable. "Well, all right," the director sighed. "The papers are ready. Please read and sign them. The child will be taken now." At these words, the father instinctively held Thomas even tighter. Eleanor Vance also reached out to the little boy, but stopped herself. It was decided it would be better this way, for them and for their son. Soon, only the adults remained in the office. Thomas was taken by a nurse. She managed to cast a disapproving glance at Eleanor Vance. She endured it calmly enough. Anyone who hadn't been in such a situation had no right to blame them for anything. Well, then life went on as usual. To avoid questions from neighbors, the couple rented another apartment in a distant area. Eleanor Vance went back to work. Life seemed to become easier. But the thought of the little boy left in the orphanage, of course, couldn't help but torment both parents. Husband and wife tried not to talk about their action, silently stewing in their own feelings. Every day, Eleanor Vance gave herself many arguments for such a decision. Thomas was receiving the necessary treatment. They were raising their eldest daughter properly, not depriving her of attention or material wealth. Her husband wasn't slaving away at several jobs at once. He looked like a human being again, not a tormented zombie. It was better for everyone this way. And yet, the woman often couldn't sleep at night, constantly trying to imagine what Thomas's life was like in the orphanage now, Was he well fed there? Was he being hurt? Or maybe he had been adopted by a wealthy family long ago? Her husband also worried, tossing and turning beside her without sleep, but remained silent. The man tried to lose himself in work. The furniture reupholstery workshop gradually turned into a large company. He had to work tirelessly, but the money was also sufficient. At Eleanor Vance's job, things were also going well. And generally, the economic situation in the country had changed a lot. Money appeared in the family. Over time, the couple could afford an apartment, their own, not rented, and then they bought a car. Now they went to the sea every summer, something they couldn't have dreamed of before. Sometimes Eleanor Vance thought that if Thomas had been born now, they wouldn't have even considered putting him in an orphanage. Now they could buy their son all the necessary medications and even afford expensive surgery. Apparently, her husband had similar thoughts because one day, when Sarah was fast asleep in her room, he decided to have a serious conversation. And how old is our son now? 10 years old? Almost 11? The woman replied quietly. In all the time that had passed since visiting the orphanage, the couple had rarely dared to talk about the boy. Sarah didn't remember at all that she had once had a brother. I've been thinking, what if we could take him back? Yes, I think about it constantly. But I'm afraid, will he forgive us? Will he understand? And he's probably been adopted long ago. So you're not against it? Relief shone on the man's face. Why, I've been thinking about it for a long time. I just didn't know how to talk to you. Of course, I'm not against it. I've been tormented by a terrible feeling of guilt all these years. The woman finally admitted her feelings and immediately felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her soul. Sarah, how do we tell her about it right tomorrow? Let's tell her. Just need to find the words. She might react in an unpredictable way too. She's a teenager after all. Eleanor Vance thought. Sarah often asked her parents for a little brother or sister. But after what they had been through, the couple couldn't even think about another child. And now, at such a tender age, their daughter would suddenly learn about her mom and dad's terrible act. How would she react to it? It was terrifying to even imagine. Let's not tell her anything for now, Eleanor Vance decided. First, we'll go to the orphanage, find out the situation, meet Thomas, and then we'll see. They didn't postpone the trip. The very next weekend, the couple got in the car and drove to the neighboring region along the same road as 10 years ago. They told their daughter they were going to visit her father's friend. The orphanage hadn't changed at all over the years, except perhaps there were more swings and slides in the yard. The director was still the same woman who had spoken to the bewildered couple back then, on that terrible day that divided their lives into before and after. She recognized them immediately. I remember you, the woman stated, examining the visitors. You're the ones who left the boy here. That was about 10 years ago, I think. Your story is unusual. That's why I remember it. Usually we get children from troubled families. A case like yours is rare. We would like to take our son back. Eleanor Vance got straight to the point. Oh, really? Confusion appeared on the director's face. We were living below the poverty line then, her husband began to explain. We couldn't provide for the children properly, and Thomas also needed treatment. That's why we took that step. Now things have settled down, and you decided that the orphanage was like a temporary holding place for the child. Bad situation. Handed him over to the state, then changed your minds and just took him back. The director didn't hide her irritation. You shouldn't judge us without being in our shoes, Eleanor Vance warned. She wanted to say a lot more to this arrogant woman, but she didn't. Angering her now would be foolish. They were too dependent on the orphanage director. You won't be able to take your son back. He's not with us anymore. Where is he? Eleanor Vance jumped up. Where is Thomas now? I cannot tell you that, the director replied dryly. And now, please be so kind as to leave my office. Why won't you tell us? Is it a secret adoption? At least give us a hint. The father persisted, convinced that he would leave the orphanage with his son. Leave the premises, the woman repeated in an icy tone. Otherwise, I will be forced to call security. First they abandon the child, then they demand him back. There was nothing they could do. The couple left the office empty-handed. On the porch, a nurse approached them, a plump, elderly woman with kind, sad eyes and an amazingly wrinkled face. Are you Thomas's parents? She asked sympathetically, looking at the bewildered visitors. You're the ones who left him here because you couldn't afford to treat and feed him? Yes, and we are those very villains, the man replied. Well, why villains? The old lady said. Don't listen to our director. She's wicked, awful, a bad person. Do you know anything about Thomas? Eleanor Vance looked at the nurse hopefully. Of course I do. The old lady sighed sadly. Oh, the little boy is his mother's spitting image. The same blue eyes, the same light hair. That's where he got his good looks. What happened to him? Where is he? I have no good news for you. The nurse lowered her eyes. He's not alive? His little heart gave out 4 years ago. Didn't make it to the hospital, so the expensive medications didn't help. The ground gave way beneath Eleanor Vance's feet. The woman staggered. She almost fell. Her pale husband barely managed to hold her by the shoulders. I thought, well, it's better for you to know the truth, the nurse continued. After all, you're his parents. Otherwise, you would have started searching, hired detectives, hoped for years, and then found out anyway. Thank you for the truth, Eleanor Vance choked out. It really is better this way. How can we live now? Yes, I understand. It's hard, the old lady agreed. But you have to live. You are not to blame for anything. The little boy was sick. Without treatment, it would have happened even earlier in your family. And Thomas had a good life here. Everyone loved him. The boy was very kind and affectionate and smart too. The couple remained silent all the way home. Eleanor Vance understood that the nurse was right. Thomas was doomed from birth. But she couldn't help but blame herself for being cowardly back then. Even if her son had lived a shorter life, it would have been surrounded by loving relatives, not strangers. The woman understood. This guilt would now remain with her forever, and nothing could atone for it. Of course, the couple told Sarah nothing. Thomas remained a great secret. They never spoke about their son and his fate again, not even to each other. It was too terrifying, too difficult, but they couldn't help but think about him, of course. Not a day passed without Eleanor Vance remembering her little boy. She secretly prayed for him, lit candles in church, and constantly reproached herself for her faint-headedness. The realization that nothing could be changed now weighed heavily on her. To her own surprise, Eleanor Vance gradually got used to this life. The feeling of guilt became a part of her personality, without which the woman no longer conceived of herself. Her daughter grew up and went to study in Moscow, then got a job there, settled in the capital. She was no longer nearby, which saddened her parents. But at the same time, they were proud of Sarah's successes and were ready to accept her departure, as long as their girl was doing well. Eleanor Vance had recently retired. Her husband was still working. The workshop in the garage had turned into a large furniture factory, and Eleanor Vance's husband was a department head there, a big shot with a decent salary. He enjoyed his work. The woman suspected that work allowed her husband to distract himself from sad thoughts. Eleanor Vance finally immersed herself in housekeeping. She had worked all her life and didn't have enough time for the house, but now their apartment was perfectly tidy, and the table groaned under the weight of culinary masterpieces. It turned out that taking care of loved ones was a pleasant pastime, not a burdensome duty as it had seemed before. True, there weren't enough people to take care of now, only her husband and the unpretentious cat Barsic. But Eleanor Vance was still happy. She dreamed of grandchildren that her daughter would bring to Grandma and Grandpa for holidays. Oh, on them, Sarah's children, Eleanor Vance would make up for lost time. The only thing that clouded the woman's measured life, besides, of course, her usual thoughts about Thomas, was her deteriorating health. And just now, Eleanor Vance was returning from the clinic. She deliberately chose the route through the park. She liked it here, beautiful, crowded, spacious, and so many swings for children. This is where she would bring her grandchildren. The sooner the better. Eleanor Vance even smiled at her dreams of grandchildren. She suddenly clearly pictured a boy and a girl, twins. A plaintive, thin voice pulled the woman out of her sweet reverie. A tiny boy was tugging at Eleanor Vance's coat sleeve. He looked no older than 3 or 4 years old. Wide open blue eyes, an upturned nose with a scattering of freckles, light curls peeking out from under his hat. A real angel from a picture, only very thin. The child remarkably resembled Thomas. Eleanor Vance had last seen her son when he was a year old, but she had no doubt. At 3 or 4 years old, he looked exactly like this little boy. Her heart clenched painfully. The woman had to take a deep breath to compose herself. The child spoke again, and his words made Eleanor Vance start. The boy clearly needed help. "I'm cold, I'm hungry, and Mommy is still not here." The little one looked bewildered and scared. He looked at Eleanor Vance with eyes full of hope. The woman took his hand firmly, and together they slowly walked around the park several times, looking for the little boy's mother. The boy, who introduced himself as Billy, diligently looked around, but he didn't see his mother. "Let's go to the station," Eleanor Vance decided. "Perhaps your mother has put out an announcement and they are looking for you everywhere." The woman, holding the little boy's hand tightly, found the duty booth. The man in uniform assured her that no announcements about a missing child had been made today. No one had been hit by a train, and generally, the whole day had been surprisingly quiet and peaceful. "And what should we do with him now?" Eleanor Vance asked, bewildered, gesturing with her eyes toward the frightened, tired little boy. What to do? What to do? Children go to the police. the duty officer replied. Homeless children often hang around the station. Kids from troubled families, runaways from orphanages. This one certainly didn't run away from an orphanage. Evil, Eleanor Vance replied. The duty officer's indifference irritated her. The woman called a taxi and went to the police station with the little boy. The child fell asleep sweetly on the way, trustingly resting his heavy little head on her lap. Eleanor Vance stroked the boy's light curls and was once again amazed by the foundling's resemblance to Thomas. And maybe it wasn't a coincidence? What if fate had sent them a chance in their old age to atone for their guilt? Billy was abandoned. That was obvious. Brought from somewhere far away, left on a playground in an unfamiliar city. Eleanor Vance didn't even condemn his parents. Who knew what situations people face in life? She knew about that firsthand. True, of course, the little boy's mother had acted carelessly, leaving her son in danger. Who knows who might have found the child? Bad people, stray dogs. Perhaps the bewildered, desperate woman simply hadn't thought about it. Eleanor Vance was sure that only extreme need and despair could have driven Billy's mother to such a step. Anyway, the little boy was unwanted. Most likely, an orphanage awaited him. So maybe take him into their family, become his parents with her husband. Well, or rather, his grandmother and grandfather. Her husband certainly wouldn't object. But of course, no one gave Billy to Eleanor Vance. The boy was taken to a children's hospital for examination, after which he was destined for an orphanage. And his mother was declared missing. At home, Eleanor Vance talked her husband's ear off about the foundling. The very next weekend, they went to visit the little boy in the hospital together. Billy was genuinely happy to see familiar faces, hugged Eleanor Vance as if she were family, and shook hands with her husband in a businesslike manner. Billy turned out to be talkative, telling his visitors about his hospital routine, asking 1,000 questions about the world, sharing observations about the doctors and other adults around him. Eleanor Vance was falling more and more in love with this unusually smart child, and saw that the same was happening with her husband. When it was time to part, Billy hugged them tightly and didn't want to let go. Tears welled up in the little boy's eyes. "You are so good, so kind. I'll miss you, like Mrs. Gable." "Is she your grandmother?" Eleanor Vance seized on the thin thread. Perhaps there was a relative on this earth who cared about the blond little boy. "Our neighbor in the barracks," Billy replied. Eleanor Vance sighed sadly. Just a neighbor. From then on, Eleanor Vance and her husband often visited Billy. First in the hospital, then in the orphanage where the boy was transferred after the examination. The woman repeatedly asked the head of the orphanage to let her take the little boy into her care. Eleanor Vance imagined how good Billy would be in their apartment. They would surround the little boy with care and love, take him for walks, feed him goodies, and read him interesting books. But while the investigation was ongoing, this was out of the question. And then Billy's mother was finally found. She was found in a city by the sea where she had decided to start a new life. Young Lucy, a graduate of an orphanage, was enjoying freedom and luxurious sea landscapes. She didn't need a child. She easily left him in the park near the station. Her live-in boyfriend, Mitch, had advised her to do so. The man, twice Lucy's age, an experienced father of many children, suggested that if she put Billy in an orphanage, his mother would have to pay child support until he was an adult. But this way, he got lost, and that was that. How many such lost children were there across the country? Lucy and Mitch even put out an announcement about the child's disappearance, but they staged the loss at a station almost 1,000 kilometers away from where they abandoned Billy. Lucy received a real prison sentence for leaving a child in danger. She was sent to a women's penal colony. There she wrote an official refusal for her unwanted son. Now at least, Billy had the status of an orphan. But Mitch got off lightly, which seemed unfair to Eleanor Vance, as it was he who had prompted Lucy to commit the terrible act. But for some reason, the man was not charged with complicity in the crime. Eleanor Vance and her husband didn't ponder the serious step for long. Both had long since sincerely loved Billy and were happy to welcome him into their family. They talked about their adoption plans with their daughter. She was surprised, of course, but she had nothing against a little stepbrother. She even seemed happy. However, the guardianship authorities refused the couple. "Where would you take such a young child?" the woman in horn-rimmed glasses explained, looking at the visitors with pity. "Your age isn't right, and neither is your health. We are not allowed to give him to you because of your age, even though you seem to have all the conditions for raising a child." Eleanor Vance and her husband returned home disappointed that day. They had already been making plans on how to arrange the nursery and which clubs to enroll the smart boy in. And then this. And what were they to do now? How were they to tell Billy that they wouldn't be taking him home, as they had promised? And why had they given the little boy hope prematurely? Why hadn't they gone to the guardianship authorities first? It was, of course, very foolish of them. The couple continued to visit Billy at the orphanage. They brought gifts and sweets and walked with the boy around the grounds. The little boy had become completely family to them. How could they give up on Billy? How could they stop thinking about him? It was impossible. "I need to talk to Lucy," Billy's mother, Eleanor Vance, announced to her husband one day. "Oh, really? Why do you need to do that?" he asked, surprised. "Perhaps she will write some kind of statement saying she is giving the child specifically to us." "Billy is nobody to her," the man reminded her. "She abandoned him and has no right to make any decisions regarding him." "But maybe I'll learn something else important. I want to help Billy. You understand? When I imagine that the boy will have to spend his whole life drifting in an orphanage. I understand. My heart aches for him too. I just don't even imagine how your meeting with his biological mother can help. But I feel that I need to see her." Suit yourself. Eleanor Vance found out the city where the penal colony where Billy's mother was serving her sentence was located. It wasn't close. The woman traveled for 2 days by train to northern Stepnovsk. Eleanor Vance had never been to such a gloomy place before. Grim staff, gray walls, an oppressive atmosphere. It was even hard to breathe here. A silent woman in a blue camouflage uniform, after a thorough search, led the visitor to the visiting room. The room resembled a living room in an ordinary apartment. A sofa, 2 armchairs, a bedside table with a TV, a carpet on the floor. Soon Lucy was brought in. She turned out to be a very young girl, looking even younger than Sarah. thin, dark-skinned, with angry black eyes. "Who are you?" she asked the visitor suspiciously. "I don't know you." Eleanor Vance introduced herself and told how she had found the frightened little boy in the park. "Oh, so it's because of you I'm here?" Lucy smirked. "If not me, others would have found him," the woman remarked fairly. "There were gypsies wandering nearby. I hoped they would take him with them. They need little ones to beg. Especially since Billy has a Slavic appearance, people give more to those." Eleanor Vance felt anger boiling up inside her towards this shameless girl who wished such a fate upon her own son. And how could such a wonderful little boy as Billy have been born to such an unprincipled, selfish mother? Maybe the boy took after his father? Outwardly, he certainly didn't resemble his mother in any way. "Where is Billy's real father?" Eleanor Vance asked. She suppressed her irritation by sheer willpower and continued the conversation with Lucy in a calm, even tone. Billy's fate now depended on this girl. It was not wise to anger her. "Father?" Lucy snorted. "He lived somewhere, got married. I think he had a daughter. Things happened quickly for David, and yet he swore love to me, asked me to come back with Billy, begged me to let him see him." "Please tell me more." Eleanor Vance suddenly felt a surge of hope. It was unlikely. But what if Billy's father was a decent person who would be happy to have such a son and take him from the orphanage into his family? "What's there to tell?" Lucy grumbled, and then suddenly brightened up. "All right, I'll tell you everything, but not for free." "How much?" Eleanor Vance inquired. The girl thought about the amount. She clearly didn't want to sell herself short or scare the visitor away with too high a price. "5,000, I think, will be enough." Eleanor Vance tried to hide her relief so as not to whet Lucy's appetite. "All right," the woman reluctantly agreed, took half the amount from her wallet, and handed it to the girl. "The rest later." "Okay," Lucy immediately cheered up. "The story isn't original, but it's long. So, as they say, make yourself comfortable and listen." Lucy grew up in an orphanage. Her childhood was difficult. Hunger, cruel caregivers, humiliation, even beatings. Eleanor Vance wondered to herself how this girl, having gone through such torment, could consciously condemn her own child to the same. Anyway, Lucy grew up. She was given a small apartment in a crumbling barracks. It was her own place, however poor. Lucy was happy with both the long-awaited freedom and the separate housing. True, no one called her to dinner in the dining room on the first floor anymore. She had to earn a living herself, and Lucy didn't like to work. The young, attractive orphanage graduate quickly figured out how not to starve to death without slaving away at a job. She learned to live off her admirers, of whom there was no shortage. One day, Lucy met David on the street, a former classmate from the college where the orphanage administration had once forced her to study. Blue-eyed, modest, blonde David was in love with her. Lucy knew this perfectly well, but he didn't dare to confess. And the girl deliberately amused herself, making the guy blush with unexpected phrases and requests. And now they accidentally ran into each other in the park. David looked much better than in college. He had matured and become more confident. It turned out he still had feelings for Lucy. It was strange, but very pleasant. Lucy took the guy in hand. They started dating. David felt absolutely happy. He even proposed to the lady of his heart. But the guy had one significant drawback: strict parents who controlled their son's life. Of course, they wouldn't have been against such a daughter in law. And even if the wedding had taken place, David's mother and father would have constantly monitored Lucy's every step. And then she would have had to forget about carefree parties, romantic dates, and similar pleasant things. And David himself, handsome, of course, reliable, but somehow too proper and boring. Becoming his wife meant dedicating herself to family, home, and housekeeping once and for all. But no, that was definitely not for Lucy, at least not yet. So the girl refused the proposal, roughly turning away the smitten guy, and a couple of weeks later, she realized she was pregnant, and definitely by David. At first, she wanted to have an abortion, but she delayed too long out of inexperience, and the hospital refused her. What to do? No money, no job, and she didn't want to slave away. One of her new acquaintances advised her to have the baby. Don't miss your chance, the experienced woman instructed. Give birth, and you'll get state benefits, and you'll shake money out of the father until the kid turns 18. Lucy thought about it. Yes, the prospects did look good. True, the young future mother didn't imagine what a child was like back then. It wasn't a doll that stayed where you left it. Lucy realized that motherhood was a punishment. Hard labor, very quickly. The boy was born healthy, calm, according to those around her, but he turned his young mother's life into a nightmare. He constantly cried, demanded food, attention. It was unbearable. At first, David only helped with money. Lucy didn't allow him to see the baby. She couldn't explain why. Just out of spite, probably. She liked feeling her power, her might. But then, when the infant completely wore Lucy out, she finally needed David's physical help. The young father happily interacted with the baby, changed him, took him for walks outside, and Lucy could rest a little during this time. Then David started taking Billy for overnight stays. The guy was already living separately from his parents, so their consent or prohibition didn't matter to him. Officially, David was nobody to the child. In Billy's birth certificate, Lucy asked for a dash in the father column to receive benefits. But in fact, it was David who raised the baby from 6 months to about 2.5 years old. He worked remotely, so he managed to combine work and raising his son. Lucy lived as she had always dreamed: entertainment, noisy companies, romantic dates, drinking that added color to her gray weekdays. There was money. The state regularly paid child benefits for a child whom David was actually raising and feeding. Admirers were generous with drinks and snacks. Everything was turning out wonderfully. Lucy considered it fate's reward for the difficult years in the orphanage. One day, the guardianship authorities appeared at Lucy's apartment right in the middle of a party. It turned out that David had decided to officially register Billy as his son. He planned to do a DNA test to confirm paternity and deprive Lucy of her parental rights. He believed it was dangerous for the child to be with such a mother. The girl couldn't allow this because then, goodbye benefits. She threw a huge scandal at David, took her son, and forbade the guy from coming near them. Otherwise, I'll file a police report. You're nobody to Billy, a stranger. Let them figure out how you got the child. They'll accuse you and put you in jail. Lucy raved. Her older friends taught her how to deal with the child's unhappy father. Transfer money for his support. You're obligated, since you're the father, even if unofficially. If you have a conscience, you'll help, and I won't let you see him anymore. David tried to reconcile. It was clear that he had become attached to the boy and sincerely loved him. But Lucy remained unyielding. She didn't need the big problems she could expect from David. Billy grew up, and there were far fewer problems and hassles with him. He could even be let out into the yard alone for a few hours. Let him play, get some fresh air. It was good for him. The neighbors, however, complained, saying she was a neglectful mother for leaving such a little one unsupervised. But Lucy cared little for their opinion. A little over a year passed. Billy had almost forgotten David. He also stopped making himself known, although he still regularly transferred money for the little boy's support. One day, Lucy learned from mutual acquaintances that David had married and that the young family was expecting an addition. The girl suddenly realized that this news upset her. Her own reaction greatly surprised Lucy. She hadn't thought that David's personal life mattered to her at all. And yet, the girl had been sure for a long time that David loved her and Billy, that he was ready for anything for their sake. She could twist the guy around her finger, manipulate him, play on his feelings, and then suddenly, this. Well, all right, what could she do now? In Lucy's life, another great love appeared. Mitch, a shift worker, old enough to be her father, but strong, confident, knowledgeable about life, and with some money. With such a man, she wouldn't be lost. True, Billy still got in the way of the adults. He needed to be fed, clothed, and occasionally taken to the clinic. He asked 1,000 questions a minute, constantly demanded attention. A lot of money was spent on him. In short, Mitch suggested getting rid of the boy, and a suitable opportunity arose. The couple decided to move permanently to a city by the sea. Mitch had some friends or relatives there. The journey was long. A small boy could easily get lost somewhere along the way. Lucy didn't object. Early motherhood weighed heavily on her, and the need to care for her son irritated her. Of course, she could have given him to David, but then it would mean he had won, and Mitch advised against it. If you remain his mother, child support debt will pile up and you won't be able to pay it off later. Lucy didn't want that fate for herself. Therefore, she didn't put the boy in an orphanage, because with official registration, all her details would remain in the database, and she would have to transfer money for Billy's support until his 18th birthday. No, thank you. She liked Mitch's plan much better. Leave Billy at the station in one city and then report his disappearance at a completely different station. And then no one will find any trace. How wise that decision seemed then. Lucy was sure the plan would work. But in the end, things didn't turn out as Mitch and Lucy had hoped. The neglectful mother was still found. And now she was here, in the penal colony, serving time for leaving a minor child in danger. This was something she and Mitch hadn't foreseen. And he turned out to be a scoundrel, Lucy spat angrily. That Mitch, when they cornered us, he blamed everything on me, and he got off clean. But it's all right. I'll get out of here, and I'll get revenge on that bastard. Thank you for your candor. Eleanor Vance thanked Lucy after listening to her. You really have had a difficult life, and yet, after all, you have an apartment. You could have had a job. It's easy now. The father helped support the baby. I can't understand how you could abandon such a miracle. Well, take this miracle for yourself, since you're so good, Lucy replied irritably. Not that good. Eleanor Vance shook her head. I made mistakes in my time too, but they won't give me Billy. They say I'm too old to be a mother to such a little one. Well, so be it. He lives in an orphanage. I grew up there, and it was fine. Eleanor Vance said goodbye to Lucy and left the building. A plan to save Billy had already formed in her head. If she understood correctly, the boy's father was a good, decent person. Eleanor Vance knew his name, knew the city where he lived. It was Orlovsk. She knew his approximate age and the place where Billy's father studied with Lucy. Finding the man probably wouldn't be difficult. And then she would have to act according to circumstances. But Eleanor Vance was absolutely certain that she needed to find David. Returning home, the woman actively began her search. She started by monitoring social networks. She checked all of Lucy's friends and also sifted through friends of friends. There were many Davids among them, but none fit the description. Then the woman placed an announcement in a local news group, briefly describing the situation. This step yielded an unwanted result. Eleanor Vance began receiving calls from pranksters who thought it was very funny to introduce themselves as David and make the caller believe a nonsensical story. At first, the woman answered every caller with hope. It seemed to her that Billy's father had finally been found, and therefore the boy was saved. But soon Eleanor Vance was scolding herself for her rash act. Calls came at the most inconvenient times, distracting her from important matters, making her nervous and worried. In despair, the woman shared the problem with her daughter when she called to check how her parents were doing. "Mom, why didn't you consult with me?" Sarah reproached. "I didn't want to distract you. You have so many worries. I thought I could handle it myself." Delete the announcement before you're completely harassed by calls. "We need to hire a private detective. I'll take care of it." That must be expensive. Very expensive. Not as much as you think, but it's reliable. But there was no need to contact detectives because David called himself. That same evening, Eleanor Vance had just deleted the announcement when another call came in. "I'm calling about your message in our city's news chat," a quiet male voice said on the phone. Eleanor Vance thought it was someone calling to amuse themselves again. She had gotten used to it over the past few days, and so she replied dryly and reservedly, "I'm listening carefully." "I think you're talking about my son. My name is David. His is Billy. The child's mother didn't let us see each other. They disappeared from the city not long ago, so everything seems to fit." "What is the boy's mother's name?" Eleanor Vance had a control question ready that weeded out the curious and the pranksters. "Lucy, her name is Lucy. Please tell me quickly, is Billy all right?" "It seems it really is you," the woman concluded. "Answer a few more questions so I can be sure. You know, I've had a lot of jokers calling me about this lately. I even had to delete the announcement. Of course, I myself want to understand if it's my boy. All right? What does the little boy look like? How old is he now? Describe your son's appearance." "Billy is almost 4 years old. He has big blue eyes, light wavy hair, and a button nose. He's smart for his age, picks things up quickly, loves strawberry ice cream, adores animals, and constantly asks questions. Billy is very curious, and he's quite..." "I understand." Eleanor Vance smiled. "You know your son very well, and it seems you truly love him. So where is Billy now? I understand Lucy isn't with him." "The boy is fine. Billy needs help very much right now. the woman replied. Something unpleasant happened to him. It's even scary. And the child is in a shelter now. He's a wonderful boy. I wanted to take him in myself, but the guardianship authorities didn't approve. They said I was too old for adoption. And I really wanted to help him, so I found you. You can't even imagine how grateful I am. David's voice trembled with emotion. I'm coming to your city soon. Write down my address, Eleanor Vance suggested. I think we need to meet and talk about a lot. Besides, it would be good if we went to see the boy together. He's probably forgotten you by now. He was very little when you were taking care of him, but he's used to me now. He trusts me. Let's go to Billy together. Wow, David exclaimed. So you're even aware of such details? I really did take care of the child myself for about 6 months. Lucy wasn't up to it. I went to see Lucy. I talked to her. Otherwise, I wouldn't have found you. Eleanor Vance really wanted to see David before he went to see Billy. It was important for her to make sure that he was a reliable, decent person with whom the boy would be happy. So she went to meet the man at the station. Eleanor Vance recognized David immediately. The young man looked remarkably like Billy. Or rather, the boy looked like his father. David didn't come alone. A little girl, who looked no older than a year, sat on his arms. Probably Billy's little sister, as blue-eyed and blonde as her brother. A pretty young woman hurried alongside the man, trying to keep up with her husband. Eleanor Vance rushed towards this beautiful family. As soon as she saw the young people from a distance, she understood. Billy would soon be in safe hands. If only they would give him to his father. With him, the boy would be happy. What luck that they have found each other. Thank you so much for not abandoning your son, for finding us. David looked at Eleanor Vance and smiled broadly. And then he introduced his charming companions. This is Kate, my wife, and the little one's name is Maisie. She's our daughter. But they didn't go to the orphanage right away. They had to wait for visiting hours. Eleanor Vance helped the family settle into a local hotel. The woman offered them to stay at her place. Her husband and she herself would have been happy to have such wonderful company, but Kate flatly refused to impose on the hosts. You've already done so much for our family, she told Eleanor Vance. I always dreamed of having many children, and definitely an older boy. It seems that wish will come true soon. You'll like Billy very much. Eleanor Vance smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. He's just a wonderful little boy. How I've missed him all this time, David confessed. Finally, visiting time arrived. The whole group, led by Eleanor Vance, sat in the orphanage lobby waiting for Billy to be brought out to them. The staff were already aware of the situation. Some couldn't hold back tears upon learning that the little boy had found a loving father ready to take him into his family. All that remained was the paperwork. To take Billy, David needed to collect a pile of documents, but they could meet now. Just don't rush to hug him right away, Eleanor Vance instructed. Otherwise, he might get scared. He probably doesn't remember you. I understand, David nodded. Of course, I understand that my son has forgotten me. He was just a baby when Lucy took him and forbade us from seeing each other. And yet, why didn't you fight for the child through court? Eleanor Vance asked the question that interested her. After all, it was dangerous for him to stay with his mother. I tried, David replied, lowering his eyes sadly. but I was practically a stranger to him. And to do a DNA test, I needed the consent of Billy's legal representative, which is Lucy. As you understand, she, of course, didn't give her consent. Billy was a source of income for her. It clicked, Kate said. There are many mothers like that now who live off benefits. And then a wealthy man appeared, and the realization, there's a man, the need for benefits disappeared, and the child was in the way. Well, that's the result. It's good that everything turned out so well. It could have been much worse. It's even terrifying to imagine the dangers that threatened the little boy who was abandoned in an unfamiliar city, in a park near the station. The young woman's voice trembled. Tears welled up in her eyes, a flood that Kate was trying her best to hold back. Obviously, she took the situation to heart. Soon Kate will be a wonderful mother to the little boy, loving, caring, understanding. You are Billy's guardian angel, David smiled, looking at Eleanor Vance. I have a child myself. Kate stroked her daughter's hair, who was sweetly dozing on her mother's lap, waiting for her older brother. And I don't understand. I just don't understand how you can do that to a baby. Eleanor Vance silently shook her head. She completely agreed with Kate. The woman had repeatedly tried to find excuses for Lucy, a poor girl from an orphanage who hadn't received parental love and care in her time. But her imagination failed her. Perhaps there was just a certain type of person, selfish, insensitive, unprincipled, and there was nothing you could do about it. Billy was very lucky that David and Kate were now in his life. There couldn't be better parents for the smart boy. The door to the lobby finally opened. The adults turned their heads towards it as if on command. Standing in the doorway was a caregiver, an elderly, slightly plump woman in a white coat. She smiled kindly at those present and shook everyone's hand. The caregiver was holding little Billy's hand with his huge blue eyes. The little boy had been prepared for this meeting. He smiled affectionately at Eleanor Vance and stared with interest at the people she had brought with her to the orphanage. Well, Billy, these are the guests I told you about, the caregiver said to the child. Go on, introduce yourself. The boy ran up to the adults and looked cheerfully at Kate and David. They smiled, looking at the charming little boy. So, you are my new friends? Billy asked seriously. It's great that you finally came. I've been waiting for you. At this point, David and Kate, despite Eleanor Vance's and the orphanage staff's warnings, couldn't contain their emotions. They hugged the boy from both sides, enclosing him in a cocoon of caring hands. The boy stood there, blinking in surprise and smiling. Then, when the emotions had subsided a little, a fascinating conversation began. Billy, as was his custom, showered his visitors with questions. He was interested in his future, asked about the city he would soon move to live in. It was important for him to know what his room would be like. And Billy also declared that he was simply delighted with Maisie and offered his help to David and Kate in raising her. He importantly announced that he already had experience. In the orphanage, he was the only one who knew how to play properly with the youngest residents. The little girl also clearly took a liking to the cheerful, energetic boy. She smiled at Billy with a toothless grin and reached out her chubby hands to him. The 2 hours allotted for the visit flew by unnoticed. Eleanor Vance's heart sang at the sight of this wonderful picture. Everything turned out even better than if she had been allowed to take Billy from the orphanage. Yes, she had become very attached to the little boy, but now he will have young parents and a little sister, and most importantly, his real father. No one could replace a blood relative. Orlovsk was preparing for the New Year holidays. Garlands and thematic figures decorated the streets. Shop windows beckoned with announcements of winter sales. Eleanor Vance decided not to take a taxi, but to walk to David's house. Her bags weren't heavy. She had packed only a few things, just for a couple of days. She arrived. The gifts for all members of the wonderful family pleasantly weighed down her hands. With what pleasure she had chosen all of them. After that first meeting at the orphanage, Billy didn't stay within the walls of the state institution for long. Knowing David's unusual story, everyone went out of their way for him. The administration, the guardianship authorities, and the orphanage staff. The DNA test was ready in the shortest possible time and confirmed the obvious. Billy was indeed David's son. The other documents were also collected quickly. Then a psychologist worked with Billy, explaining that the little boy would now live in a family, that David and Kate were his parents. The boy quickly accepted David as his father, but he called Kate Auntie for a long time, although he had become attached to her with all his heart. The woman gave the boy a lot of attention, love, and affection. With her, he literally blossomed, became calmer and more confident. But still, the little boy still remembered his real mother, Lucy, and loved her, despite everything. Kate didn't rush the child. She was understanding of his choice. And just the other day, a real pre-New Year miracle happened. Billy finally addressed Kate with the long-awaited word, Mom. It made me feel so warm, so light. Kate shared her joy with Eleanor Vance. They now often talked on the phone. Of course, Eleanor Vance kept in touch with these pleasant people. Billy had brought them together, connected them with an invisible thread. The elderly woman was grateful to fate for meeting David and Kate. Now she had real friends in her life. Yes, they had become friends. Despite the significant age difference, they were comfortable and happy together. Eleanor Vance regretted that Billy's family lived so far away in another city. And David and Kate, it seemed, also missed her because they constantly invited her to visit. And so Eleanor Vance finally packed her bags, bought gifts, got on a train, and came. She wouldn't stay for the holiday itself. She would return home. Sarah had promised to visit her parents for the new year and hinted that she wouldn't be alone. She would probably finally introduce them to her fiancé, and then grandchildren wouldn't be far off. Soon, very soon, little ones would appear in Eleanor Vance's life in addition to Billy and Macy, who had already become family. The snow crunched loudly underfoot and sparkled beautifully in the light of the streetlights. Here was the right house. They were waiting for her there. Billy would rush to hug her from the doorstep and, of course, immediately shower her with questions. He would probably ask about the train, about the journey. Eleanor Vance was welcomed warmly. A late table awaited in the living room, and the aromas of delicious pastries wafted from the kitchen. The evening was warm, heartfelt, and cheerful. Eleanor Vance enjoyed talking with David and Kate, listening to new funny stories about the little ones. And yes, life with such tiny ones simply couldn't be boring. The young parents looked a little tired, but very happy. Our family became complete thanks to Billy, Kate confessed. With his arrival, I realized that this was exactly the kind of little boy we were missing. David looked at his wife with tenderness and love. It was obvious that he was grateful to her for her attitude toward his son. Yes, the man was truly lucky. People like Kate were rare indeed. And then Eleanor Vance played with Billy and Macy, built towers out of blocks, hosted a tea party for dolls, and spent a long time pushing the children on the indoor swing, enjoying their ringing laughter. And before bedtime, she read the little ones a fairy tale. Both listened with interest to every word, even tiny Macy. She was in a very cute age now, trying to imitate everything her brother did, like a little monkey. Then, Eleanor Vance lay on the sofa in the guest room assigned to her and smiled. The household, tired from the day's chores and impressions, were asleep. The wall clock ticked in the apartment. Sleepy, quiet, peaceful. Eleanor Vance was used to being tormented by thoughts of Thomas before sleep. She tried to imagine his life in the orphanage, without parental love and affection, wondering if the caregivers or the other children had hurt him. All this weighed terribly on her, preventing her from being happy. But now for some reason, it felt easier. Memories of the terrible mistake no longer caused such mental anguish. Billy had somehow miraculously healed the old wounds. No, Eleanor Vance did not absolve herself of guilt. She still felt a heartbreaking pity for the son who had been dealt such a difficult fate, a poor, abandoned, sick boy. But the woman finally decided to tell her daughter everything. Sarah, of course, was shocked. For a while, Sarah just blinked silently and tried to catch her breath. So stunned was she by the sudden revelation of the secret. But her daughter did not turn away from her parents, as Eleanor Vance had imagined all these years. On the contrary, she pitied them, accepted this terrible choice, and even supported them. "How do you live with such a heavy heart?" Sarah whispered, hugging her mother and father. "But you were young, lost, and scared, and no one supported you. My poor dears." Yes, the tragedy with Thomas will forever remain with Eleanor Vance. But now life had become much easier. She had been given a chance to save a child so remarkably similar to her son, and she had done it. Now Billy was in a loving family, and Eleanor Vance's soul was filled with joy and peace.